Welcome back. Hope you all had a great break. You got some lamingtons, you got some drink, you're ready to sit down, watch another talk. And this time, not one person, not two, but three people are going to be talking at your face. So I want to welcome to the stage. We have Cameron, we have Zane, and we have Josh. Welcome, folks.
Hey guys.
So, who do I address? Who's in charge here? Is it like a?
Well, no one, but Zane.
What are you going to be talking to us today about?
We can't hear you, Zane.
Can't hear you, Zane.
I was muted. Cool.
Yay!
Yeah. First
I've
day
never done
of the
it before.
presentation. So we're at Repair4 Interactive. We're going to be talking a bit about our development on a complex player controller and some dev stories, do's and don'ts regarding the development we went through. We think there's a pretty good amount to learn from this, especially if you're interested in designing complex movement systems from a design or programming point of view. Designing that and considering that, and also talking a little bit about some of our mistakes and do's and don'ts.
And hopefully
This is
just having a bit
literally
of fun.
This is literally my job, so I'm looking forward to seeing.
Yeah.
This is going to be great. So I'll leave.
Oh boy, we've got a lot of mistakes to show off. So hello everyone. We are Repair4 Interactive. Ironically, only three of the four of us are here today. I'm Zane. I am the designer for Repair4 Interactive, and these are my two programmers.
Woohoo! Hello guys. I'm Cameron.
That's it. I'm Josh.
That's it.
I'm Josh. Yep.
Yep.
Cool.
And we've been working on this game for a few months now. We're here to talk about why movement is a lot harder than it sounds, and why you should probably plan these things out a bit more than we did at the start. There are a lot of intricacies and difficulties with designing movement systems, especially in this first-person environment we're going to be talking about. And we wanted to share some do's and don'ts, some dev stories, and just generally talk about our experience developing in this subgenre. So, we need to give a little bit of background on what our game is. Our game is called Onigatana. It is a retro FPS game, sort of like a Doom or a Dusk type game. The emphasis is placed on melee combat, so using a sword, obviously. There are no ranged weapons. Melee necessitates either some kind of mobility or durability inevitably, since these games are so heavily designed around the player and enemy interaction. The player needs some way, if they're taken away from the ranged aspect of combat, to close the gap between themselves and the enemy. We tested both making the player a drain tank that could heal off every hit, and making them a speedy, almost ninja-like character with a ton of different mobility options. And that mobility options route tested a lot better with our testers, so it's the one we decided to go around with. Also, frankly, it was just a lot more fun. We had a lot more fun playing around with that version. Yeah. So this is a disclaimer. We're not the authority on how you should do this. When we first started this project, we were very, very new developers. We'd just gotten out of teaching, or just gotten out of learning at AIE. We just graduated, and we decided, let's make a game that we really love, and let's try something a bit ambitious for our first project. We went through a lot of unnecessary pain because of this, so you might cringe at a few of our decisions early on. But hopefully you can take something away from this, and hopefully you can have a bit of fun, maybe laughing with us, maybe laughing at us. This is primarily a dev story and a discussion of design implications that result from these types of things, rather than you should do specifically this because we did it like this and we know everything about how this is meant to work. Yeah. We know very little in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, very much do not do it like we did it.
Yeah. Ultimately, our controller at the moment feels really good, but it is not by any means the only way or the best way to build or have the controller for your games.
For an idea of how long it took us to get to the stage where we are at now, where we're pretty happy with our controller, Josh didn't have a beard when we started working on this project. So it's been a while.
Yeah.
So why is complex and powerful movement difficult to develop for? This is just like a little dot point summary. The first one, as the number of movement options increases, the number of level design options you have shrinks. I like to think of this as sort of a parabolic equation where as you add more, there does become more level design opportunities. But once you hit a certain critical mass of options that are given to the player, you actually start reducing the number of options you have for design. This manifested for us when we hit a breaking point a few months ago where players had so many different capabilities available to them that they could literally fly anywhere on the map if they knew how to do it. we had almost no restrictions on what the player could do. And this meant that every arena had to be some variant of a boxed-in area that stopped the player from moving, and we had to have these giant walls come down to stop them from going anywhere. It actually shrunk our level design options quite significantly.
At that point, what's the point in having all this cool movement if you can't use it?
And we just don't have the team. This is 4 of us. We don't have the team to be designing big, open world games. Maybe not yet, anyway.
Maybe not yet. See us in 12 years when we've achieved world domination.
Yeah.
So movement mechanics build on each other in very enjoyable ways, but also sometimes they're very unintended. There's both positive and negatives to this. Players are way better than you at finding exploits for your movement mechanics. I'm pretty sure everyone here has probably seen at least one speedrun where someone's clipped through a wall or something. Let me tell you, people found out ways to beat our levels in less than half a minute, and it was, oh boy.
Yeah,
it was surprising.
Something.
Yep. It was very, very surprising because we thought we had a really good grasp on how these things would interact with each other, but players found very bizarre ways to abuse some of the momentum mechanics and ways to break it in really bizarre ways. Third, as you ramp up the complexity of any player controller or set of movement mechanics, you have to be really careful if you add more options that you don't invalidate existing options. We're going to talk a lot about this when we get to our original version of the grappling hook. That grappling hook is going to be the boogeyman for most of this slide because it was one of the decisions we ever made during development. And you have to be careful that your use cases for various game elements don't overlap with each other in a way that over relies on one of them. You don't want players to be forced into using one specific option at all times. The common idea is dominant strategy. You don't want if you give the player a simple option that's effective and kind of does the job of everything else, which is surprisingly easy to do when you're designing a movement system, it's very easy for players to get completely sidetracked by that one mechanic and then ignore all the other cool stuff that you spend hours and hours making, and you just cry as no one touched your dash for the first 3 months of testing, and you spent so much time making it feel good. And I'm probably getting a bit too personal here.
Dash is the one that went right.
One that went right in quotation marks.
It went right, and no one used it initially.
But yeah.
Third thing is we need to factor these things really early into development. To some extent, we knew what we wanted to begin with. We want to make a game with Quake-style movement of strafing and moving quickly along the ground without a sprint button, but we didn't know what other parts we wanted yet. Josh, you have a story about a mentor telling you this, right?
Yeah, so I have my original teacher and my mentor, I went to him and I was like, I've got to build this movement controller, and I'm just at a loss at this point. And he said to me, he goes, well, Bright, you need to get Zane, your designer there. He goes, you need to get him to detail exactly what he wants to be put into that character controller then and there, before you even start building the thing, so that you can start taking into consideration, I'm going to have to add a dash feature. I'm going to have to add a slide feature on top of, the grappling hook and all of that. We kind of wish we took that advice.
Yeah, to some extent, we knew, okay, we want a dash, we want a slide, and we even want a grappling hook. We didn't realize that would involve reshaping the way gravity works in Engine and completely defying the laws of God to make it to work. There are so many different things that we had to do that we didn't consider because we didn't mark this stuff out early. Also, obviously, you can't design levels until you have a fully developed movement system. I've only been able to recently start developing levels for this game because we've only just finished our controller, essentially. And then finally, engine constraints.
This is kind of my thing. Basically, I found very early on, so we're developing in Unity, and I found very early on that with the speed that we were moving at, there was a lot of considerations I had to make to like hitboxes and things like that, and our physics system. We found pretty quickly that Unity's physics system as it stands, and again, this may just be a bit of a misunderstanding of how the Unity physics system works, but at least for us, we found very early on that the Unity's physics system just wasn't going to cut it. So I actually spent a lot of time implementing my own gravity, my own velocity gravity systems, my own acceleration systems. We're still using Unity's character controller, that component, but at the end of the day, all it's there to do is move the character around. I do all of the calculations myself, and then just pump them through the character controller, so that it can still interact with some of Unity's other systems.
The base
Yeah.
engine
But
stuff.
yeah, very quickly found there were some engine constraints that we just hadn't thought of before.
So why do we need complex movement in this game? And I figured this would be worth, why do we even want complicated movement? What's the reason for it? In this genre, there are a number of reasons that you would want to have a movement system that is beyond WASD and jumping and the basics of like standard retro FPS Quake movement. And we have a couple reasons why we decided to go down this route. The first is that players within the subgenre respond very positively to additional forms of skill-based movement. You can see this through the games that are incredibly popular in recent times being praised for their movement. A lot of games are now being called movement shooters in this subgenre because people are so excited about these new opportunities to essentially convey themselves through their movement. Games like Ultra Kill have made a name for themselves off of the way that you can move around in that game. Another source is me. I like it. That's the other source. Yeah, we like it. But that is to say that players within the subgenre responded very well to some of the stuff we were pitching with regards to the complicated movement systems. The second one, and probably the most obvious one, is that since we are a game where ostensibly the player is playing a first-person shooter with lack of access to ranged weapons, there needs to be some way to make the act of closing the gap between the player and the enemy more exciting than holding the W key. Holding the W key to move forward is super boring. We want to have ways that we can differentiate the environment and give more challenges to players based on what we think would be exciting in the combat encounter. And having only WASD plus jump to work with in this case means that a lot of fights would just evolve into the player mad dashing towards every enemy and just like hacking them to bits, and it kind of getting really old really quickly. There's a lot to be said for making the actual... There's a lot to be said that potentially even the most fun part about this game isn't even going to be the act of slashing enemies open, but the act of learning how to close the gap and learning how to get close to things is going to become possibly even more important than the actual...
And on top of that, not getting hit, right? Like,
yeah,
the whole point is to approach the enemy, get close to them to hit them without yourself taking damage. Because ultimately how you lose is either you fall down and you die, or you get hit by a barrage of projectiles or heavy attacks.
There's a bit of an awkward design space where you're kind of learning how can we make it so that the movement feels impactful, but it doesn't make it so that the rest of the game has to be unfair to compensate, which we'll talk probably a bit later, but we certainly had our unfair moments during original points of design. The next reason is that the sort of theme that we're going with for the game kind of matches up well with the idea of being this fast, like swift avatar of death type thing. You're an immortal samurai with demon powers, so it kind of naturally lends itself to this idea that I should be able to have all these crazy over-the-top options for approaching things. If I had those like powers, I wouldn't want to just be walking at people with my sword. I want to be doing crazy stuff. I want to be showing off. It's almost like I'm... you're showing off, right? You want the player to be excited about the actual act of moving in this type of game, since it's
a power fantasy.
Yeah. It differentiates us in our market space a bit. This is obviously also due to our melee combat, but we really wanted to have something that could hook players in. Kind of a pun there, but we wanted to have something that excites players, and movement is very easy to showcase in stuff like trailers, and very easy to showcase in stuff like devlogs and videos just showcasing the game. Like if someone sees like a grappling hook and then you like slide down and you jump off a gap, it's very easy for them to get excited about that compared to us talking about the intricacies of how specific our hitboxes are and how good how good all that feedback is, right? People get excited when they see the player doing cool things. And finally, it's really fun. It's really fun.
We may be talking ourselves up a little bit here, but we really love our movement controller. I mean, I have been known to refer to this movement controller as my baby or as my third child. I have two children, by the way.
which
I
are
love
not
this thing.
character controllers.
Yeah, which are not character controllers. That's right. But like, I love this thing. As much as I probably gave Zane so much grief while I was building this thing,
You did.
pulling my hair out. I probably regrew my beard 3 or 4 times while making this thing because things would just go wrong, right? This is game
Oh, yeah.
development. Things go wrong. But at the end of the day, we just love this thing.
Yeah.
It's and even the early iterations that we eventually shelved, we had so much fun playing around with them. There's a couple gifs coming up of like this level where it was just a bunch of massive cubes in an open plane. I would spend 20 minutes just moving around in that level, just playing around, seeing what I could break.
Put it this way, we love this character controller so much that we accepted the offer to do a 50-minute presentation talking about it.
Yeah.
We've really enjoyed working on this, and we really want to share some of the stuff we learned. So that's all well and good. The player control is cool and fun, but where's the difficulty? What's the challenge? There are a number of problems that come and arise during development when you decide, hey, we're going to go with a very complex system of movement. The first one is, oh boy, it's hard to make. Oh boy, it's hard to make.
Yeah.
It's real hard. Really hard.
I set off thinking, oh yeah, movement controller. What could be so hard about movement?
Yeah.
We're 5 controllers in, and we've only, I think, finally kind of settled on, this is it.
Yep.
And probably months of development time.
As it relates to our project, we quickly discovered that the first-person perspective is really not conducive to melee combat. In a standard like action game where your character has like a sword, like say a 3D game, you can see enemies that are all around you, which means that enemies are very rarely going to get sneak attacks up on the player. And it's also a lot easier to judge the distance of your attacks. If you look at like games such as the original God of War, for example, very easy to judge where your chain blades will hit enemies. Very easy to judge where where Kratos is getting attacked from behind. Talking about the old God of War games, not the remakes or the reboots. Yeah, but like very easy to tell in those action games. Like enemies are near me. My attacks reach this direction. You can see on the right here, actually, this is our melee hitbox. Yes, all 3.
Yes.
If you see a little bit here, you can see a little bit on the camera icon. That's the player's arm and their sword, and the rest is the hitbox. And all 3 of those are hitboxes. We learned very quickly that because of the point of view we're looking at, it's insanely hard to judge distance between the player and the enemy. And players, more often than not, would find themselves during playtesting swinging their sword and getting frustrated because it's not hitting anything.
Yeah,
and
especially when they're jumping in the air. So you can see the blue one. The vertical hitbox is really large because it's really hard to tell if something is just above the player or just below the player. So we gave a lot of room for that.
What's bizarre is that this hitbox looks utterly ridiculous when you're looking from the side, but when you're actually playing it, it feels just right. Like, we've even considered making it larger than this, put it that way. It's really, really hard to judge the distance of things.
And then, like, to talk a little bit about the reason for the 3. The reason for the 3 is we quickly found if you've just got this one big hitbox, the way, because these are actually box casts, so they're not actually box colliders. So for all your technical people listening in, these are actually box casts or array cast that goes out. We quickly found that if you've got one big one, basically it would just trigger on the very first enemy hit, and that could be the enemy all the way to your left, when you really just wanted to hit the enemy directly in front of you. And so basically the system here is that the red box in the middle is actually prioritized. So if there's anything directly in front of you, you hit that first, and then from there they go outwards. So then if there's nothing in the red one, it prioritizes the green one, and if there's nothing in the green one, it prioritizes the blue one. This in no means is probably the correct way to do it or the right way to do it, but this is the way that's worked for us.
So you might be wondering what this has to do with movement. We sound like we've just been waffling off about melee FPS games. Well, it gets way harder when you realize that the player is moving at 60 kilometers per hour. They're moving so quickly that we need to assume even more that the player is not going to be able to precisely aim at things. Consider that to obviously move around, you're going to need to be changing your camera point of view often. You're going to need to have a lot of compensation to make up for that when you're attacking things. So hitboxes need to be very, very, very generous. And this problem gets way worse when you're in the air, and it's even harder to judge distance from things. The next thing is that if you have complex movement mechanics, you need to design very complicated levels to take advantage of that. There's no reason to include all these cool, fun movement mechanics if you're not going to use them in a level. So this can quickly spiral out of control where we have this cool new movement mechanic we want to show off. Now we need to make a level that justifies it, but the level itself needs to include some kind of reusable element that we can apply to all stages so that the movement mechanic feels justified and not just a one-off gimmick. So this has led to a lot of very, I want to say, esoteric arena design, where arenas are really, really large now, and they have so many different ways for the player to interact with the movement systems. We're almost looking at the movement systems as a modular piece of the combat at this point, where we want to put grapple points down in the environment as like quick ways for the player to reposition or have gaps they have to jump across as part of the challenge.
And to build on that, when we have complicated movement, not only do you have to build a complicated level, but you have to be able to restrict the player so that they can't break the level as well. So you have to build it to not just utilize the ability, but to prevent the breaking of your game as well. So that's another level.
That part is hard because putting the player just in a box and caging them up is really unfun. It's not fun to just put a cage on the player and say, yep, play in your little sand pit, have fun. We found that people didn't like that very much. So we had to come up with some pretty creative solutions to answer that. Stuff like having arenas with like rocks crumbling down, stuff like having arenas where there would be like ghostly fog or something. We needed to do a lot of very strange fixes to make it so that players wouldn't feel like they were just playing in box arenas. And the last two things are that movement mechanics can cannibalize each other. This is going to become a bit more apparent when we talk about a certain feature, but if you have a movement mechanic, right, which is, in our case, this freeform grappling hook, it can invalidate every other option on its own because it's too easy to use, it's too effective, and it's too fun. In the case of the grappling hook here, we thought that a no cooldown, non-targeting freeform grappling hook would be a cool feature. This single line was almost the name of the presentation. It was a very cool feature and it was very fun, but it probably cost us a couple months of grief trying to get it to work before we eventually had to give it up. And we're going to talk about it a bit later.
Yeah, it's so cool that nothing else could be cool standing next to it.
Yeah.
Essentially, yeah.
So, how did we start on this road and how did we get to developing this? I remember distinctly on a cold November evening after Josh and I finished doing work together, I asked Josh, for this new Onigatana game, can you make me a movement controller with double jumping and sliding? Josh came back to me within 3 hours, gave me a player controller, and it was the worst thing I've ever played with. It was terrible.
That sounds harsh, right? But it's the truth. This thing was shocking. It was done in 3 hours. It was done just to really quickly like prototype something up. But it had double jumping, it had sliding, and it had, it had all your normal features of character control. The character could move forward, the character could move left, the character could move right, all of that. But there was no weight to this controller. There was no acceleration. There was no deceleration because and this is something that, I don't know, at least for us, comes up quite often. Zane and I think about things in very different ways. He thinks more about the user experience and, how is the user going to feel using this? I think about things as, well, how can I make this work? I just want to make this thing work. Let's go. And so Zane probably hates me for it, but I've learned over the course of us working together just to expose all variables to Zane. So our character controller, I wish we had a photo of it. It has like probably 50 exposed variables now that Zane can tweak and do what he needs to with. But at the end of the day, that seems like a lot. but this was done in a way that it meant that Zane and I could work better together. It meant I could concentrate on the stuff that I do well, which is making things work and prototyping things and just getting things into the game. And then Zane had the tools available to him to then just, make things feel good, and actually support our user, essentially.
So that was the first little bit that we started with, is we realized, okay, we're going into the deep end here. This is going to be a lot harder than we initially thought. I already knew that it was going to be difficult, but I didn't realize quite how hard it was going to be. The first thing we did is we went back to examine Quake and Doom, obviously the progenitors of this genre, and we wanted to see, what are their movement quirks? What do they do? At one point, we even recreated a bunch of Quake source code in Unity. Josh went back and basically re-engineered the Quake player controller.
Yeah, so I found Quake, one of the Quakes, I can't remember which one it is now, but it's now open source. And I found it on GitHub, and I started to basically dive into the old, someone had converted to C++, Unity uses C#, so I started converting it into C#.
And we learned a lot.
I did. I learned a lot. I learned that very quickly that the days of Quake and Doom were really the Wild West of programming, because I remember distinctly going back to that same mentor I mentioned earlier and going, has everything I've learned about character movement wrong? Because the way Quake handled movement and things is just so different to like what we're taught to do now. And I honestly, at that point, I thought, well, the guys that made Quake, they're geniuses in our industry. So it must be me that's doing something wrong. And I remember having that chat with my mentor, and he kind of calmed me down a little bit. And he said, well, look, no, it's just that we don't need to do things that way anymore, because, it's not the Wild West anymore. These things have been heavily researched, and that is why we do things, differently now. But I had a whole, I suppose, existential crisis of, maybe I'm actually just a horrible movement programmer. I don't know anything anymore.
So next step after that is that we went back a few months to look at some modern releases of games heavily inspired by these movement systems. We looked at Dusk and Ultrakill. I ended up buying Dusk for the whole development team, and we discovered a few things about how modern takes on the genre handle movement systems. One of the things we actually learned is that what we kind of initially learned, there needs to be some level of acceleration when moving forward and changing direction. When you're going from, say, strafing left to strafing right, there needs to be like a period where you massively decelerate and then re-accelerate. Otherwise, if you have a momentum-based system, the player can kind of switch directions rapidly, and it feels really, really strange. It almost feels like your character's on wheels, kind of.
Yeah.
Where
at
you're like...
one point... Oh, sorry, Zane.
That's all good.
I was going to say, at one point I created a teleporting character by just adding increased momentum every time you change direction, and at one point it got to a point where I hit the A key and I was on the other side of the Unity world, and it wasn't great.
No,
it was funny.
What are you talking about?
It was definitely funny, but yeah.
So then we went into iteration. We did a lot of tweaks, and we arrived at our first passable player controller. This is not actually the first controller we made, but it is the first one that we deemed as passable. So we'll just show some footage of this. This is a very, very old build of the game.
We had a thing for hands. We really liked these hands.
Don't worry about the gun, by the way. This was like another weird experiment we were trying out. We were never going to make a ranged game, but we wanted to experiment. You see the grappling hook there? We'll explain a bit more about how that works, because it works very bizarrely. Yeah. So we'd finally kind of gotten our controller to a point where we were relatively happy with the basics. That's a boss, by the way. Might be a bit hard to tell because he's a giant cube.
For those of you who aren't in game dev, welcome to the early stages of prototyping.
Yep.
But yeah, so we quickly found that we kind of just had a bit of a test with ranged weapons, because we're moving so quickly, we can't get melee right. we just can't. We don't.
We
feel
nearly
like
gave
it's
up.
working. We did. We nearly gave up on melee entirely. But we found as soon as we started adding even 1 or 2 ranged weapons to the game, we had this really cool sword model that Brad, our artist, he's not here. But, this sword model is really cool. We love it, and we really wanted to showcase it in our game, but we found that people wouldn't use it because they had ranged options.
They had
so
a
you
gun,
can see in
right?
this video, we're just actively trying to use the melee attack.
Yeah, there's no
At
reason.
one point, we made the melee attack like a one-hit kill on most enemies.
Yeah,
like, we've got to
one-hit
make
kill.
people use this thing.
It was like a one-hit
yeah.
kill that could attack like 8 times per second, and people were still not using it.
Yeah.
And at that point, it was blatantly overpowered, but people just didn't want to use it. So we decided this experiment was a bit of a failure. So let's talk about the first technical problem we had, which is how do we actually detect if the player's on the ground?
Yeah. So this was an interesting one. It quickly actually became a bit of a nightmare for myself and Zane a little bit, because every time I thought I'd fix something, I hadn't. For one, and it's actually not as simple as just checking to see if the grounded player is grounded. So Unity's character controller has a grounded feature, but I quickly found that was fairly inaccurate for what we were doing, and there was so many missed sort of jump inputs and things like that. So I quickly moved away from that and invented my own little grounded check, which was just a straight raycast down from the bottom of the character. If there are any programmers in the chat, they will know that this is a horrible idea, because our character obviously has some girth to them or some width, and if you're doing just a straight line or straight raycast down, you actually miss a whole lot of essentially a whole lot of colliders to note that you're grounded. One of those being, we could walk to the edge of an object, and you couldn't jump anymore because suddenly you weren't grounded, but you were still standing on the object. So yeah, big issue. So then once I fixed that, I started to implement more of a sphere cast system. A sphere cast, it's a little bit more round. It's a little bit more conducive to like feet, right? Made more sense to sort of have it more like feet. And so that was now we were no longer missing like grounded checks. Like if we were on the edge of an object, we hit them, everything was great. It was a
fun little story with that. Sorry, cut in. There was a fun little issue where if you stood on the edge of like a surface, because of our algorithm that detects when the player is like falling, it continually speeds up the falling speed. Some players would stand at the edge of like a platform for a while, and then they would fall down at like 2,000 miles per hour.
Yeah. Yeah, that was the way gravity has and kind of still is implemented. I've just added some fix in there.
Yeah.
So from there, we really needed to start checking how long the player had been in the air for, because there were times where you would jump, but because of the way gravity was programmed, because I made gravity myself, it would actually just slam the player instantly back down to the ground. And so we started to need to like know that we needed to, when the player pressed the jump key, we needed to turn gravity off for a little bit so that they could actually, rise through the air, and then we could slam gravity back on and they would start coming back down. And then there was some issues with sliding, where we'd shrink the character and all of a sudden they would be in the air because of the way Unity shrinks things. It shrinks from the middle, so they would suddenly be up in the air and they wouldn't come back down. And so there was some checks there. Basically, long story short, the solution was a whole bunch of timers and sphere casts, and now it's less likely to miss the grounded checks.
There are a couple of different cute things we've done to make this feel good. One of the things we learned kind of early on is that players like to get very close to the edge when they do like a double jump over a platforming puzzle. So this would often result in players getting frustrated that they kind of missed the jumping window to get their second jump. Since obviously if you're in the air, you don't get the second jump, you only get the one jump. So we added a little bit of a grace period at the end to once you've like left the grounded situation for the next like 0.2 seconds or so, you still get to keep your second jump, just to help with that sort of feel. And those little tweaks like that ended up kind of becoming emblematic of how we decided to design the player controller for convenience ultimately.
Did we talk about the slope?
We should probably talk about that.
We will talk about that soon, I believe.
Okay.
Let's talk about gravity. I think we do need to speed up a little bit, actually.
So, basically, I hit on this a little bit earlier. A custom character controller meant custom physics, and custom physics came with custom gravity. There was a big issue, and I think Zane ended up he ended up pulling his hair out over this one, because for a while players would just hop down slopes. Because they would move slightly forward, fall, move slightly forward, fall. And so basically I realized very quickly I had to implement a almost constant gravity. But because I implemented a constant gravity, the player would then fall really, really quickly if they just walked off a ledge. Whereas if they jumped, because I was turning gravity on and then reapplying gravity, they would fall at the normal rate of what made more sense. So I fixed that. Then the players would hop down the slopes again.
And we went round and round.
I actually, to this day, probably can't tell you what the actual solution was. I think it was just a whole bunch of like state checks, essentially, to just make sure that the controller knew what state it was in, and basically how much gravity, or not how much gravity, but whether gravity or not needed to be applied. And so now, thankfully, you can actually walk up and down slopes normally. You can actually slide up and down slopes, which was another whole thing because of gravity. And yeah, you can fall off ledges and you don't fall at stupid speeds anymore. It's terminal velocity. That's what it was. I implemented terminal velocity, so you could no longer fall at ridiculous rates.
All right.
Yeah.
So let's talk about dash. Dash is, you can kind of see a bit of a little clip of it here. It's kind of just like a quick little move in a direction that you're moving in. It consumes a little charge in the center, but basically it's the simplest movement mechanic and also the one that kind of worked the best. But because it worked the best, it actually ended up getting kind of neglected by players. It worked, and it worked really well, but players really struggled at finding a reason to actually use this one over the slide and over the grappling hook. It wasn't until much later when we implemented iframes onto the dash and made some of the other movement mechanics like toned down a little bit to make it so that they weren't so over-centralizing, that dash kind of came into its own as a tool you use almost for correcting your movement, like in the air specifically. Dash is like an aerial movement tool. Every other movement mechanic was just way more fun to use. Sliding was so enjoyable. Grappling was incredibly fun. Players didn't want to mess with a basic mechanic like this, even though as developers, we kind of knew that this was necessary to give players some level of control over their airborne speed. After we pivoted away from the Hetl grappling hook into the one that we're using today, it became a lot more frequent to see in playtesting sessions.
And on top of that, we added more in the level to actually make the player want to stay in the air. So people were ending up to use that dash.
Just quickly, there's a little interesting thing about dash is it actually turns off gravity. So for that time, you actually dash forward at the height you start your dash, and you end at the height that you started your dash. And so it actually allows players to stay airborne for that slight little bit of extra time, which we definitely found was much more fun.
So let's talk about the grappling hook from hell. This was one of the first things we built, and it was one of our favorite things. So this grappling hook, just from the footage you might be looking at, looks almost nothing like a grappling hook you might have seen in another video game. This is more comparable to like a hook shot or maybe Spider-Man's webs. The idea is that if player A is like here, I need to see if my camera actually sees this. If player is like here and the wall is like here, the player grapples to it and then bounces off of it, right? You're kind of using it for momentum and using it, instead of going to that point, you're pulling yourself along it and bouncing off, almost using them as like stopgaps and to accelerate your momentum. And this was insanely fun. This was so much fun. We would spend hours just doing what's happening on screen right now, going around this arena, just like using the boxes to like move around. Now, you've probably got a lot of a lot of thoughts seeing some of the gameplay here, and oh boy, we have a lot of problems with this hook. But initially at the time, it was really, really fun. The fact it had a very low cooldown and it was so spammable made it feel like a core part of the movement. The non-targeting made it not feel restrictive as to where you could use it. You could just use it wherever you wanted. It was really, really fun to just kind of have the ability to move wherever you wanted when you wanted. The added momentum that it gave you, which was kind of the intent, is that this would be a momentum tool that you could use to accelerate your speed and then transition into a slide and then jump and then slide jump to maintain your momentum, felt really good. But there's a number of issues with this. So you may have actually already noticed this from the footage, but one of the first issues we found is that you can grapple to the floor. And we couldn't really find a very healthy answer to this, aside from just marking the floor as ungrappleable. And this problem resulted in players being able to go at light speed wherever they wanted, whenever they wanted. And there was really no elegant fix for this without kind of taking away that freeform aspect. So grapple, at this point, this was kind of like the calm before the storm, before we realized how many issues this really had and how many implications this had. The grappling hook became simultaneously one of our coolest and most problematic features that we had to spend an unholy amount of time trying to get it to fit with the rest of the game design. Initially, players responded very positively to the hook. They loved how fast you could move around. They loved it. But then I made another environment that wasn't an open space with giant cubes. And players started complaining a lot. The first major issue is that it is really, really awkward to mash your face into a wall to accelerate your speed. It looks jarring to like push your head into a wall and use that to make you go faster, because usually we associate hitting a wall with slowing down. So players just felt like this was awful. It felt so bizarre to them the moment it was outside of this controlled environment. And players started to find it more unwieldy. One of the other problems that arose from this version of the hook is that because it can target any point on any surface, the player needs to be really, really, really precise with where they aim. And this doesn't seem like that big of a deal because it's an FPS game and players need to have good aim to begin with. However, there's a problem when you're asking the player to look one direction, hit an enemy, look in a completely different direction in like a split second and aim at a wall at a specific point of it to move themselves around, and then turn their camera again to face the enemy. It resulted in so many jarring like camera movements that the player needed to learn and do that players just got disoriented when playing the game, and it wasn't very enjoyable to play through. This contributed to another issue where, because we didn't want to take away the fact that it was freeform, we had to overcompensate melee hitboxes even more than they currently are. They had to be ginormous. It was at the point where it was barely even a sword anymore. It felt like a great sword or like a giant club.
Well,
and
we became a ranged game at that point.
And kind of the largest problem overall is that the hook was just over-centralizing. It invalidated every other option the player had because it was just too good when you actually knew how to use it. And it was kind of frustrating to use at the same time. It was very unforgiving, where if you hit a slightly different part of the wall, you could end up catapulting in a direction you didn't want to. And that frustrated players a lot throughout playtesting.
9 minutes, guys.
Yep. So we pivoted. We are now using a non-freeform grappling hook that targets. This was the hardest development decision we had to make. It was killing our baby, essentially.
Yep.
Yeah. It's truly tragic.
Baby, my baby. I'm still crying about this.
Some of the strengths of this version are that, one, it is now much easier for players to hit because they are tied to specific grappling points in the world. The actual raycast we send to detect if the player has hit a ball can be really large. I mean, the player doesn't need to precisely aim at these to lock onto it, which makes it a lot more easy to flow into. It also is more conducive to level design and prevents exploits like players flying wherever they want because we can now control where they're grappling to. And it made all the movement mechanics kind of fit in with each other. Sliding was a feature that we decided on relatively early after we tested it out and felt it was fun. It went through so many iterations, but the one thing we wanted to remain consistent was the slide hop. As a bug early, you were able to maintain your speed after slide jumping, and you would become super fast. And we knew this had to be a feature. It was so much fun. So
it was
good.
just it was a complete like accidental thing on my part in the programming. I basically just didn't negate the momentum that slide gave you after you jumped, and you'd hit the air, and because basically our air movement it never negates, like our air movement never negates momentum at all, and if you timed your jump correct, you would fly even further, and it is probably now one of the more fun features we have.
Yeah, you move quick, you move fast, you just feel so cool when you use it.
we went through about 5 different iterations of this slide, one of which had the version where it was infinite and you can just keep holding it down. This one just kind of didn't work and didn't feel good. There was a cardinal slide, which kind of worked similar to the game Warframe, if you've ever played that, where sliding would happen in the direction that you were aiming your control. This ultimately felt too similar to Dash and kind of took up the same play space, so we didn't end up enjoying it. Then we had a slide version that would inherit the momentum of what you were currently doing and extend its duration and speed based on that. This sounded like a really good idea on paper, and then the player would slide off the map because they were already going so fast. Yeah,
And through things,
it didn't work. So we eventually settled on a slide which has a fixed duration, but can be cancelled by jumping or grappling. This way you are somewhat committing to using it, but it doesn't feel too committal to where it's frustrating. And it gets to maintain that fun slide hopping gameplay that we really like. And 5 controllers later, this is where we are. We'll show off a quick little demo of this because we are actually running pretty close to time. But this is where we are on the current iteration of the player controller. We're relatively happy with it now. We have a variety of... It's not really shown off in this little bit. I'll skip ahead. The player can dash now a lot more effectively. Slide hopping is really natural to do, even in like these tight corridors, which we found to be quite good. Although I would still probably prefer larger arenas than this one. Dashing across feels natural.
It just allows you to move across the map really quickly, but we've no longer got the issue. I mean, touch wood, we've no longer got the issues of players being able to really break our maps with the movement. They still feel quick, but they don't feel as they don't feel restricted. Is what we've been finding through playtesting.
So let's talk a little bit about how enemies are part of movement.
Alrighty, so this is I got to dodge making the player controller, and I was responsible for the enemies and kind of the other stuff. So, but enemies need to be factored into your player controller. They should be considered as obstacles, just like the level itself. They present a question to the player, which is how do I beat this enemy, right? So the player is forced to answer it, particularly in games where movement is vital. You will want to have the enemies present a problem that requires movement. So an example of this is a gap that requires, like a gap, a chasm, requires some kind of vertical movement, some height to get over it, whereas a basic projectile from a basic enemy requires some kind of horizontal movement. And that's just a basic example, but as enemies become more complex, the more complicated movement the players have to use to solve those problems.
One example of like how we designed enemies to do it is that early on, one of our boss enemies, which is a great Tengu, he has an attack where he launches a wind slash, and the wind slash is vertically tiny, but horizontally very large. It's like a wind blade, essentially. And this was designed in such a way to encourage players sliding under it or jumping over it rather than trying to dodge to the left and right of it. We wanted to have enemies kind of work almost like puzzles in that regard, where you need to dodge at certain times and using certain tools.
The next thing is we want the enemies to engage with the controller, right? So enemies should either or do both. So they should either attack a movement, so to hurt a player using a particular movement, punish a player for using a particular movement, and or encourage a player using a particular movement pattern or movement ability that they have. This can be on top of other combat abilities that the player has, but we like and we've found success in having enemies that attack both. This bull spider you see on the right here,
it's a Gyuki if you're a yokai fan.
Yeah, he's a normal projectile enemy who sits up on the top of the map that shoots out projectiles that are slow, but when they land, they create some kind of poison field for the player to remember and to dodge and to jump over. But when they get close, they charge the player, and the player has to, like a bull, and slide under the spider to avoid the attack. And it's really fun. The next step here is to switch up the solution. So when the player is just presented with the same problem over and over and over again, that they can use the same movement solution every single time, they're going to get bored. So make sure that within the same combat arenas, if they are significant combat arenas, that the player is using more than
Different-
different movement tools that they have.
There is a bit of conflict there where you don't want to be demanding too much of the player, because if you're demanding them to both slide and if you're demanding them to slide and grapple at the same time, that might cause some issues where one enemy starts dealing unavoidable damage, and you need to factor that into your arena and level design pretty heavily.
And lastly, we got the goals of the enemy. So the goal of an enemy is to engage all parts of the controller, or enemies in total, is to engage all parts of the controller. Movement in most cases, right? So if movement is a vital part of your gameplay loop, it should be a vital part of your combat loop as well. It would be such a shame to make such a complicated movement system to just throw out when the player gets to do the coolest thing in the game, which is slay enemies. On top of this, players will feel smart for giving them opportunities to use things that aren't their combat abilities to win combats.
Yeah. And now let's talk about probably the funniest thing we messed up. So we alluded to there would be some mistakes you might cringe at, and this is probably the big one. The size of our player character is 6.5 meters tall. So very early on, we kind of lost track of scale because we started using the movement almost as a judge for how far apart things were, and that resulted in us overscaling the hell out of everything. Our player controller is 6.5 meters tall. The player moves 70 meters like a second is at their cap. It's way too big, and we've started to feel some of the consequences of that. Problems like draw distance. Yeah,
draw distance is a big one. Because like the terrain system in Unity, how it works is that we can only render in so much grass based on a distance. But because the terrain expects you to be using a normal scale, like our player can be just standing and they're like 10 meters in front of it. The grass isn't rendering. That's a problem. And we're going to be forced to rescale a whole project. So please, if you're new developers, think about scale. Use like a 1.5 meter size character and everything should be scaled.
Balance everything around that. Because now we have to redesign all the variables for our character's speed so that it actually feels the same, because we can't just directly scale it down by a set amount since variables don't work like that. So
they should, but they don't.
Yeah, they should.
They don't. And then there's more issues like lighting, which result from this.
So we don't know for certain, but we'll find out very soon. We've been having some performance issues in a game where we've actually actively been using performant code, and we're a little confused about it. And we're thinking that our lighting is going to be the issue, given the size of the lights themselves and how much rendering there is to figure out for the lighting system. But we'll get back to you on that.
And that's it. That's all we had. We had a lot more we could have talked about. We had to cut this down because we are incredibly eager to talk about this thing.
This is my baby, so I'm very excited. I love this thing.
We'll be here to answer questions and lurk for a while about stuff. You could follow us on Twitter. We haven't got anything out yet since we're still kind of preparing before we show off our project to the masses. And we have a Twitter as well. If that website survives, we'll see. That's a spin.
And we do have a YouTube channel coming out soon, so
devlog soon.
We'll post that. We'll post that somewhere in the Technically Games.
And that's us.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, guys. Like I said before, not only do I program character controllers, I used to be a teacher at AIE teaching design. So hearing you say a teacher said something, you ignored it, and they were correct. Great joy to my heart.
We're now the teachers doing that.
We all now teach at AIE.
So please tell me more things that teachers told you and you ignored.
Basically everything. Scale was a big one. I think I remember our teachers harping on about how scale was so important, and I guess we just forgot it in like the excitement of like we finally had this amazing character controller done. It was so quick, and like it's actually a real big programming. It's an issue a lot with programmers is that we get in and we just build stuff, and we're not artists, we're not designers. Quite often we don't think about scale, and so I would just like that world you see where it's just big cubes, that was something I think I did, where I just dropped some big cubes in because I was like, these would be cool as walls, right? But then it meant scaling up the character controller, and then basically we just kind of lost sight of what our scale should be. And I remember our teachers harping on about scale.
The other major thing I think we missed was we were told to do testing early for this stuff. We were kind of ashamed at the start to even start showing it off because we had so many broken like exploits you could use with the movement system that we wanted to kind of get it to a stage where it was pseudo presentable before we could test it. But as soon as we did like a testing session, everyone was like, yeah, you need to rework this grappling hook, it's not working.
And that was another thing, like teachers and like it's something I tell my programming students all the time is test, and don't be ashamed of like a broken mechanic or something like that. People don't care. They know it's a development build, and that's what you're using them for, right?
Yeah. One of the other major things which kind of biting us in the bum right now is that we got told to just make a square box arena and get everything feeling perfect in there. But we were like, oh, we need levels. We need it to look good. We need to do all this kind of stuff. And we kind of lost sight. We are right now upgrading our combat to be a little bit more in depth. But with as you add more in-depth combat, more level design considerations have come up, and so those previous levels that you saw here aren't going to work anymore going forward.
Listening to all the mistakes you're making, like first of all these mistakes you're making, these are the common mistakes, which I love. And you mentioned the detecting the players standing off a ledge and giving them some time before they jump. There is a term for that called coyote time, as in Wile E. Coyote. A couple of us sit at the same time in the chat as you're mentioning it.
Coyote time,
Coyote time.
That was exactly
so
the research that went.
I actually didn't know that. I should know that.
Yeah. So but programming a character controller obviously is difficult. Like it's and the problems you're facing, like the fact that you use the Unity's character controller, thinking, "Oh, this is Unity's character controller. This is great.
It'll work."
And not realizing it's very simple. It's designed to be simple. It's designed to do the basics. And there are people in chat talking that they're doing basically the same thing you're doing. You're using the skeleton of it and then programming all the fuzz around it.
I think that if there would be one, sorry.
I was just going to say, it just doesn't have enough. It just felt like it just didn't have enough physics baked into it for it to be like complex enough for what we needed. It was good enough to just move the character around and then interact with like Unity's collision system and things like that, because I still want to interact with Unity's collision system. I mean, we're using Unity for a reason. I mean, it makes game dev accessible, and it means that I don't need to program collisions. But at the same time, I want the controller to move well, and that meant my own physics system. Which
if I would have one takeaway from this whole experience, it would be that the ultimate way to make these things feel good is to do a lot of those coyote time type things. You want to have these little tweaks that exist that make no sense if you're looking at it from like a realistic point of view, but little things that make it easier to actually control, because it turns out controlling a digital character is really hard and just really weird. We're kind of used to it since we play so many games, but the actual act of controlling something that isn't you using the WASD keys is bizarre, and like it doesn't work most of the time. And stuff like the grappling hook we mentioned, where the hitbox for detecting whether the player is aiming at the grapple point is like 4 times as large as the model, because it means that the player doesn't need to actually put in too much effort to actually get there. It's reasonable for them to do that. That type of thing really helps, like a lot.
Baltus in the chat says this is something that every programmer should really do as an experiment.
Yes, I would agree. It's such a rewarding.
It gives you kind of an appreciation of Nintendo, who are probably one of the kings of doing this and have been since for any 3D moving characters around, and how difficult this is. And the fact that that Josh, you went and looked at Quake code was hilarious to me. For one, fantastic. And two, that's kind of like looking how the Romans built their houses. It's like, they built these amazing houses. Why don't we do it that way? There's a reason we don't do it that way.
Yeah, because of all the bugs that it introduced.
Yeah, exactly. But that made me very happy. But that code is fantastic to read through. I've definitely seen it myself.
It actually taught us a lot about like small things we learned, like a bit about like how to do acceleration, deceleration, and changing directions, for example. We picked up on that a bit from the Quake code. That was one of the early things we really felt was just bad, is like we have this acceleration, we have this deceleration. When I turn from strafing left to strafing right, feels awful. Like it feels like I'm sliding or I'm on wheels or something. And we want it to feel more natural, because obviously when you strafe in real life, or if you move left, you can't just immediately start moving right with the same speed. So that was one of the first big things we picked up from Quake Engine code. It was like, oh hey, there's like a little bit of a deceleration period when that happens.
I mean, there was that dark moment where we were going to use Doom's engine.
Oh god, yeah, we had a moment where we were considering using Build Engine for a while for this project.
Well, there's a reason that they abandoned that code a year later for Quake.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah.
Cool. Thank you so much. Obviously, your details are on the screen if anyone wants to follow you. When can we play this game?
Probably next year or so.
Yeah.
We're hoping next year.
I think we're hoping early next year.
We're trying to get a demo out pretty soon, in like a couple, say like maybe around July. We can't really make promises because this project's been a bit tough and we are working full time as teachers, but we are getting this project out. We've made a blood pact, we've signed the sacred treaty, but this should be roughly, we should have an early access build some point around just before the middle of next year.
Yeah, and if you follow us on our socials, we'll keep you updated.
We're going to be posting devlogs and things about this type of thing. We're starting to ramp up.
Fantastic. I'll see you all in the chat later on. Bye-bye.
Awesome. Thank you so much.